this is the first of our Autism from Menstruation to Menopause live events. We won't have a set pattern of when we're going to have them. We'll just have one every time we've got something new and big and chunky and exciting to share with you. Um, so the plan is that we're going to record this first part where I speak. So what I'm sort of planning is that I'll speak for about half an hour. As I'm going through, put any thoughts, comments, reflections in the chat. Um, and at the end, we'll have time and we'll stop the recording and we can have a wider conversation all together. It's not just me here today from the team. So I am very ably assisted by Becky Ellis, Rebecca Ellis, uh, and Amy Nisa, and they're going to be looking at the chat whilst we go along. So they'll be answering some of the questions. So Becky was involved in doing this research with me as well. They might not answer all of them. We can save some of them for the end. And Danielle is also here, and Danielle is my brilliant admin support. So for any tech issues, if anybody gets locked out, maybe we could put Danielle's email address in the chat. So it's danielle.bird@swansea.ac.uk. So you might want to make a note of that in case anything goes wrong. But if you get kicked out, you should just be able to get back in with the same link again. Okay, I think that's all of the housekeeping. And before I start, does anyone have any questions or anything that they've got concerns about? Okie dokie then. Ah, that's always very lovely. So, yes, so tonight I'm going to take you through some of our recent research. And I've called this session Autism and the Menopause. What does the research say? And I just wanted to acknowledge really that even though I led this piece of work, it definitely wasn't just me alone working on it. So the Autism from Menstruation to Menopause project is funded by the Wellcome Trust. They very kindly gave us about £2.5 million. And there's a big team of people working on this review. So Becky Ellis, who we have here, Harriet Axby, who's another one of the researchers on the project. And the project is run with a community council of autistic people, and four of them with lived experience joined me in working on this project. So that is Willow Holloway, Hazel Lim, Selena Kamauer, Monique Crane, and then we also had an autistic GP, so a primary care doctor for those outside of the UK, our only man who is allowed to work on the project. And just recently, about 4 weeks ago, I think, our findings were written up in the journal Autism in Adulthood. So they are now available online. So maybe, Becky, if you could drop in the links to that. So we weren't able to pay the journal's publication fee, but there is a Word document that's available on ResearchGate as well if you wanted to read the full text. And if you can't get it, just nudge me afterwards as well. Okay, so I've told you a little bit about the team and the publication, but let me just give you an overview of what I'll be covering tonight. So first of all, I'll tell you a little bit about what the Autism from Menstruation to Menopause study is aiming to do. And then I'll bring this directly back to autistic menopause. So I'll tell you a little bit about how we search for evidence, and then I'll break down how autistic people experience menopause into three areas. So those are knowledge, symptoms, and managing symptoms. So a lot of that is healthcare. And then I'll share some early thoughts on how to best support autistic menopause, and put up our contact details for questions. And just as I go along, feel free to put any questions in the chat. Oh, and yes, actually, Becky's just posted, I think, if anybody wants a shorter summary of our findings, we have an 800-word piece on the conversation that Becky's just popped into the chat. I think I should also say as well, I don't know if I made it clear in the beginning, but the whole research team on the Autism from Menstruation to Menopause project are autistic. And I also have lived experience of perimenopause, including my first visual migraine this week, which was a special treat that I could have done without. Um, Okay, so that was our overview. And let me just give you a brief snapshot of what our big project is doing before we hone in on this evidence review. So, the grant application for this study was developed with the autistic community. So, I did an online consultation, and then I also had two autistic advocates who are part of Autistic UK help me write the grant application. And if we go from the left side of the screen to the right, so the burgundy boxes are the first things we did. So we developed a community council of autistic people, and this is the first one in Wales. And then the second thing we're doing underneath that is reviewing existing evidence, and that's where this menopause evidence review fits. And then the yellow box in the centre of the slide is what Becky, Amy, and our two other researchers, Harriet and Krisha, have been busy doing for quite a number of months now. So we have 100 autistic people who were assigned female at birth. And we are interviewing them up to 10 times each. So every 6 months, they're asked if they'd like to do an interview again. And we've divided them into four kind of life course stages. And one of them is for people who've got menopausal symptoms. So we'll be getting more information on autism and the menopause as we go along. We'll be getting some information about how autistic people find HRT, which I think is going to be really useful as well. And then the blue box on the side of the screen are just the ways we're trying to make it have an impact so it doesn't just sit on a dusty shelf in a library somewhere. So we're doing a public engagement like this event. We have our social media, which we've got a big list of at the end. We're working with health professionals, both neurodivergent and neurotypical. And we will be developing a toolkit in 2029 and 2030. So there will be some menopause related resources in there. I've got no idea what they might be at the moment, but we've got quite a bit of time to work out what would be best for our participants, but also then we'll take those ideas out to the community to get more ideas. And our big aim is that we can improve healthcare. And, obviously our project is focused around reproductive health, so things like periods and the menopause. But really, we'd like to do anything we can to make healthcare better for autistic people, because I think most of us have probably had some kind of negative healthcare experiences. Okay, so that was all of the beginning bit, and I'm going to jump right into this review now that you've come to hear me talk about today. So we did a search online, something that's called a systematic review. If you're not into research, please don't worry about the any new words you hear me say now, because they aren't going to be really important in your life. But we looked for research evidence on autism and the menopause between 2003 and 2023. And we also added some newer studies that came out as we were doing our review. So we found 8 research studies, and because we knew there wouldn't be that many studies, we also included blogs that were in the public domain, and we found 7 blogs as well. And generally, the quality of the research was pretty high. I did the coding, and what that means is I was the one that read through everything, and you kind of chop everything up into little bits and pieces, and you almost like put them in baskets of this is about HRT, this is about hot flushes, and then you have all of your piles and you merge them together. So I did that initial bit of coding, and then, as I mentioned at the beginning, we had an analysis team with autistic adults with experience of menopause symptoms, autistic researchers, and a GP. And so the main bit of what I'm going to talk to you about tonight are the three key areas we found. So I think it's really important to put a bit of a caveat here that there wasn't that much research. So what we found is the best knowledge we've got today, but there have been one or two papers published since, and there will be more in the future. So if anything sounds absolutely terrifying, um, I think I would probably say that we don't know that much about autistic menopause yet. Your menopause might not be as bad as what we find, because people who have bad menopause symptoms might be more likely to go and do some research on the menopause. So we're going to break our findings down into three areas. So we'll start off with knowledge about the menopause. We'll then think about menopause symptoms and their impacts, and then also responses to menopause symptoms. So that's self-management and also healthcare. So, starting off with our first thing, then, knowledge about the menopause. And if any of this rings a bell for you, like feel free to pop it in the chat because it's always helpful for us to know if anything's similar or if anything's different. So the first big thing we found was that autistic people in these research studies didn't know much about the menopause generally. And some of them said that they thought this was because the menopause was quite taboo or it was a stigmatized subject. Nobody talked about periods often. Um, and there was a tiny bit of evidence that some people felt that they had enough about the menopause generally, but that they didn't know about specific parts. So that might be like the mental health impacts of the menopause, or what it was like to be autistic and go through the menopause, were things that they didn't know about. And overall, people said that there wasn't much known about autistic menopause. So, how that might be different for autistic people to go through the menopause. So, there weren't any resources available, and there wasn't enough information available from doctors. Some people also said they didn't know that menopause might be different for autistic people until it happened to them. And we'll talk about the symptoms next. Um, and and overall, this lack of knowledge led to people being quite worried and confused. So one person thought that they must have been pregnant because they just never heard that periods would stop at any point in your life other than for pregnancy. Some thought that they might have been quite unwell. People really, didn't have the knowledge to understand what was happening. And I mentioned peer support briefly previously. And so some people did do their own research online. Um, and they said that this sort of peer support could reduce their isolation. But actually, there were also some worries. So there were concerns about the quality of what they found. So on anonymous forums, for example, where people don't have to put in a name, you could be anybody. Um, and some people also said that not everybody could be on the internet all of the time, but they could go to the doctor, or that there could be community infighting that could make it less accessible. So this kind of knowledge about the menopause was our first big chunky thing we found. And our second and our biggest thing is about menopause symptoms. And this slide is just an overview of all of the different symptoms, and we'll look at them one at a time in a moment. But one of the key things that people said was their menopause symptoms often fluctuated. So that might be their menstrual cycle, but it might also be like things like hot flushes, that sometimes you're okay and other times you're just not. And that could be really hard because many of the autistic people in the research said they preferred control. They preferred to know what was going to happen so they could plan, which I think I can definitely agree with that from my own experience. So the There's a big long list on here. I won't read them all out because I'll read them out in a moment, but the order that they're in here is how many times we found them in those individual sources. So our 15 different sources that were in the review. So one thing that I found quite interesting is that we're over halfway through the list before we get to periods and menstrual cycles, which I think shows how disruptive some of these other symptoms were. But yeah, as I go through, feel free to add your experiences in the chat. When we're looking at the chat later on, we'll stop the recording so it will just stay within this group. So our first and most common symptom was mental health, meltdowns and irritability. And this was really common. In one study, 3/4 of people said there was a change in their mental health and half said there was a change in their mood. So, we might expect most autistic people going through the menopause to have some of these symptoms. Some people said that they'd had mental health difficulties before and they got worse. Other people said their mental health had been pretty stable throughout their life, but during the menopause or the perimenopause period, they had new challenges. So this could be things like finding it harder to regulate their emotions, having mood swings, so being up one moment and then down the next, and not knowing what was going to happen with those. Um, a few people said that they had suicidal thoughts. Um, some people said that they felt quite tearful, and again, that could just come out of the blue sometimes. And some people said that they had meltdowns that were either they happened more often than they used to before perimenopause, or sometimes they became more extreme, so they might be harder for the person to go through. Some people also talked about having panic attacks, feeling overwhelmed, and once they'd gone through the menopause, so when their periods had completely stopped and their hormones had regulated and they weren't having this up and down roller coaster, they then said that they could feel quite dissociated. So like they didn't quite feel like themselves. So mental health could be a really big thing for people. The next most common thing that people talked about was the way that their brain was working, which is called cognition. And this also meant that some people were just exhausted, which is sometimes called fatigue. And all of this made it harder to just do their day-to-day things. So memory and concentration was affected for around 3/4 of people in one study. And some of the things that people talked about changing were brain fog. So just a feeling like, your brain isn't quite working, like you're walking through treacle mentally. Having challenges with executive functioning. So, like, one of the things that I always say is I do a lot of parenting research, and the UK Health Service guidance has 13 steps to make up a bottle of formula for a baby. And I think, and that's without sterilizing the bottle. And I think when you make a cup of tea, it's probably the same number of steps because you've got to go and get all of the things and do it all in the right order. And that's executive functioning. That's being able to do all of those things in order. Some people also said that they started feeling quite confused when they had menopause symptoms. And fatigue was something that a lot of people talked about having previously. Um, and by previously, I mean before they started getting menopause symptoms, but before they could be really tired and they could just push through. But once they got into having quite severe menopause symptoms, they sometimes couldn't. They just had to stop. They had to cut down on what they were doing. Some people talked about this as being completely exhausted. Others talked about it as like autistic burnout. So when you're just so tired that you just lose some of your usual skills. Sometimes they come back, sometimes they don't. Um, and quite a few people talked about needing more rest and other kind of protective strategies to save their energy to be able to get through the end of the day. And we'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. Our next most common symptom people talked about was sleep. So some people said that before the menopause, they'd had difficulty sleeping. So it wasn't different for them. Um, and some said it got worse as they got menopausal symptoms, and others said they were just used to it. They'd never been good at sleeping. Not being able to sleep the whole way through the night was really common. So people talked about night sweats, which is when you literally can drench your pajamas, your nightie, or your bed sheets. And it can be really sudden as well sometimes. Others talked about being anxious. So they woke up and then they were just worrying. They had something going around and around and around in their mind that they were worried about, and they couldn't stop thinking about it. And that was new for them, or it was increased. And a small number of people said they had really vivid nightmares. Now, when people talked about things they did to make some of this stuff better, I've put it on the slides. And one of the things that people talked about was sleep hygiene. If you haven't heard that word before, it means like not looking at screens before bed, having like a quiet hour before you go to bed where you're not watching the TV. I don't know, you're like journaling or doing yoga or something. And I just don't think that works well with a lot of autistic people's lives. You know, a lot of autistic people need to have some background noise to be able to get to sleep and these sorts of things. And some mentioned supplements, but there really wasn't enough evidence to say if they worked or didn't work. Our next most common thing was hot flushes and night sweats, and most participants had these. So hot flushes or hot flashes, if you're in the Americas, are when just suddenly you're just boiling hot, you're burning up. It can go up your body or down your body. Sometimes they go along with being dripping in sweat. Sometimes it's just a feeling of being flushed. And they were very common. One person said they got a tingling feeling when they had hot flushes. Um, but apart from that, there wasn't a lot of detail. Like some people said it was hard if they'd always been very temperature sensitive. So that, I know I don't always know when I'm hot until I get grumpy, and then I need to take my socks off to cool myself down. And others said that if they were in public and they thought it might be visible on their face that they'd had a hot flush, or that they'd need to quickly take their clothes off, that that could be quite embarrassing. The next thing that people talked about was sensory differences. And this is something we don't see in the general research on the menopause. So I think this is probably linked to us being autistic. And some people said their existing sensory sensitivities got worse. So that might be to smell, temperature, light, touch, and sounds. And some people said they had completely new sensory sensitivities. So in one study, they talked about food. There was one study where they talked about interoceptive differences. So, if you haven't heard the word interoception before, what that means is how loudly you hear your body's internal signal. So, your body telling you you're hungry, you're thirsty, you need a wee, you need a poo, you really need to rest, your heart rate's gone high, you're too hot or too cold. So, all of those different things, your body gets information, your brain interprets it, and it tells you. And if you have low interoception, you might not get told very quickly. You might only know when something's really irritated you or made you dysregulated. So we don't know what the differences with interoception were, but it was mentioned in a few papers. And these sensory changes had quite a big impact on people. So the mental health and the meltdowns were sometimes quite closely linked to sensory. There was one source where a poor woman really needed her cooker repaired, and the cooker repairman smelt really badly of body odour. He hadn't put on deodorant that day, and she made him leave the house. She had a complete meltdown, even though the cooker repairman still needed to come back to fix the cooker. So it could be really, really extreme. These sensory differences could then impact on communication, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. Intimate relationships, so relationships with partners, and also abilities to function, including at work, and we'll talk about work a bit in a moment too. So, our next most common set of symptoms were headaches and body pain, and there was very little written about this. So, one study found that autistic people had more of these kind of head or body pains than non-autistic people when they compared both groups. And another study said that around half of autistic people had joint pain, and around 1 in 3 had headaches. But that was about it. So you might get more headaches and body pain during the menopause if you're autistic, but it was quite a small sample in that study where they compared autistic and non-autistic people. Moving on now, we finally get to periods and cycles, and I think it just shows how disruptive everything else was that this is so far down the list that people were talking about their periods. So, some of the autistic people in the studies and blogs we looked at said that their periods got more unpredictable. So, sometimes they got heavier, sometimes shorter cycles, and sometimes having abnormal bleeding. So, kind of bleeding between your periods. And this unpredictability could be really difficult to manage. And not just from do I have a pad or a tampon, from knowing the moods. So people previously might have known that they might have difficult moods or cravings in the few days before their period, but not knowing when your period was coming just made it really difficult. And everybody who talked about the end of their period said that they were looking forward to it, which I think probably isn't very surprising with all of these symptoms. So, our next most common menopause symptom for autistic people was around communicating with other people and masking. So, communication could be really impacted for some autistic people. So, they said that it was harder to interact with other people, and there were two separate things going on here. So, first of all, it was harder to say what they wanted. So, they might know what they want, but being able to get that out to somebody else and be understood could be hard. And sometimes this was that speaking was harder than before. Other times it was just forming what you wanted to get across. And then the second thing was when people were giving communication to the autistic people, it could be harder to think about what they meant and then think about like what you were supposed to do in line with what they'd said. So it could be much harder to understand others. And along with communicating, obviously, menopause is affecting people assigned female at birth, and typically girls are socialized to be much more compliant. And there is research that suggests that autistic girls mask more than autistic boys. During the menopause, masking could become harder, so much more energy intensive and sometimes impossible. So, just something that people couldn't do anymore. Some people said it was a relief to stop masking, but others said actually, without being able to mask, they didn't quite know who they were. It could kind of impact on their identity. It could make it harder to fit in, both in social groups and also when they were, at work. And also, people could just feel more awkward because they couldn't mask as they were used to doing. So now we're getting into the symptoms where we didn't have much evidence on these. So physical changes, we've put them all together here because there were only a few people that said each thing. So some talked about weight gain, some about the hair on their head getting thinner, some got more facial hair, some got more or even less body hair, drier skin, looser teeth, and some people found this kind of uncomfortable, like it affected their sense of self and their self-esteem, that they didn't look the way they had previously. And others just said, actually, I'm just not bothered. Like, I'm just going to go out and be me. And this sometimes fit with not being able to mask anymore. So, our last symptom then is everything to do with peeing and what's in your underwear. So, it wasn't mentioned in many sources at all. But it was quite common for autistic people in one study. So they said that half of autistic people wanted sex less than they had previously, so their libido went down. A third of people said they had drying in their vagina, and it can be, kind of uncomfortable, slightly abrasive feeling. A third also said that they had some urinary incontinence, so either just peeing yourself a tiny bit or a lot. And some said that they had pain during sex and they got UTIs, so like bladder or waterwork infections more commonly. So that's the end of our big list of symptoms. I'm just going to have a little drink. So, one of the questions that I thought people might be interested in is, do autistic people have more menopause symptoms? At the moment, we only have two small studies that gave us any data on this. And they both said yes, but they were small. So I'm very cautious about saying yes. Um, And one of the studies found that if we asked people from a lot of symptoms to very few symptoms, autistic people were more spread out and non-autistic people were more in the middle. So there might be some autistic people who have few menopause symptoms, as well as some having more symptoms. So at the moment, I don't think we know enough to be definitive, but a possible yes here. So I've mentioned briefly that some of these symptoms had an impact on people in their day-to-day lives, and work became harder for some people. So again, this wasn't everybody that talked about it, but some people said the changes to the way they were thinking and their brain was functioning and not being able to mask made work difficult. And it could sometimes be quite a sudden and large change in how they performed at work. So some people needed changes to be made to the work environment, and some changed jobs or stopped working. And as well as the workplace, relationships, both with partners, family, and friends, were impacted. And this was because of communicating feeling harder, and feeling misunderstood by partners, particularly. That the how difficult it was didn't seem to be understood, feeling more irritable. And so, of course, this had an impact on these relationships. But for people who had caring responsibilities for their own children or for older parents, that could mean they had to carry on supporting those people, and they couldn't always prioritize their own needs. Another thing that was linked to how severely people felt their menopause symptoms was knowing they were autistic. And I think this is really important. So, if you knew you were autistic, you could interpret your menopause symptoms and be like, oh, yeah, this is just autistic menopause. I'm going to rest, or I'm going to be kind to myself. I'm not going to make myself push through this. But if you didn't know that you were autistic or you didn't have much autism knowledge, people had more distress and less self-compassion, and they didn't always have these new coping strategies. So it's great that you're all here because you're getting more of that knowledge. And also, some people got diagnosed as autistic around the time of perimenopause, which might just be because everything felt harder. So I've given you loads and loads of information there on symptoms, and if it feels too much, if anything was unclear, just pop it in the chat, and I'm really happy to go back to any of them at the end. But I'm now going to move on to our final bit then, which is much shorter. And this is how people treated the menopause or their menopause symptoms. And the first thing that people did, we called self-management. And this was a lot of prioritizing their own needs, setting boundaries, stopping seeing that friend who is always really difficult and upsets you, reducing time with difficult family members, doing activities they enjoyed, managing energy and resting more. But as I mentioned, if people had caring responsibilities or they couldn't afford to go part-time at work, they couldn't always do these things. Other people did some healthy lifestyle things like restorative exercise, like yoga and Pilates. But actually, we know autistic people might be more likely to be hypermobile. So, actually, it might not be the best thing to do these unless you've got an instructor that can tell you how to protect your joints while you're doing them. Some people also tried various different diets and sleep hygiene that I mentioned earlier. But I personally would say get through it however you can. You know, eating more broccoli and less beige, I don't think is going to particularly impact on your menopause symptoms as an autistic person. I have certainly eaten a lot more beige going through the menopause than I used to because I'm just getting through the days when symptoms are difficult to manage. So, when self management didn't do enough, so symptoms were still really disruptive, people thought about seeking medical support. And most people in one study said they wanted to discuss the menopause with their doctor, but many didn't. And often this was because they'd had a negative experience of healthcare previously. For those who did go and see a doctor, they often had low expectations before their appointment. They found it hard to get appointments. And some people use private healthcare rather than state funded healthcare where it was available, which could be expensive, and obviously isn't ideal. So, thinking about appointments in more detail, then, almost all of the experiences were negative. But again, the people who take part in research might be the ones who have more to say. The people who had an okay time at the doctor's might not have bothered spending an hour doing an interview or half an hour doing a survey. But from the accounts we had, people said that their appointments felt rushed. Sometimes they saw a different doctor each time. Sometimes they didn't feel able to share their needs as an autistic person. They sometimes felt that doctors didn't understand the menopause, and they felt ignored or misunderstood when they talked about their menopause symptoms. They sometimes received conflicting information. So one person said one thing, one said something else, or sometimes just didn't get enough to answer their questions about the menopause. And then when we pull autism into this as well, the doctors didn't understand autism, or this is what the people in the research felt. They also felt that it wasn't safe to share their autism diagnosis sometimes. Sometimes they just thought doctors didn't understand autistic menopause, which isn't surprising when they felt they didn't understand the menopause generally. And two people said that their menopause was misdiagnosed as a mental health diagnosis instead. We did have a small amount of evidence that some of the autistic people said it was hard to communicate about their symptoms to the health professional, but that didn't seem to be the main barrier. So, as I mentioned, we had a small amount of positive experiences, and these included the appointment going well, so learning new information or feeling that they were listened to, or that their autism accommodations were given. So, one person talked about their GP, their primary care doctor, giving them extra time. So the next thing that I'm quite interested in is hormone replacement therapy or HRT, and I was really surprised. It was barely mentioned in the research. Just a few people mentioned a little bit. So some people said they were worried about side effects, and that impacted on their decision about whether to ask for it. Some said they couldn't get it on a prescription from a health professional. the people who did use it, we really didn't have much information. One person said they stopped because of side effects, and one person said they didn't get followed up by their doctors afterwards. Now, in the main Autism from Menstruation to Menopause study, in the interview study, we've got 25 people going through perimenopause and having menopause symptoms, and over half of them are taking HRT. So we will have more information about this in the future, and I'll definitely come back and share it with you. So, some of the things that we thought of as missing, but do feel free to put anything else you can think of in the chat, was incontinence. There's much more about incontinence written in general menopause research. HRT wasn't spoken much about, and intersectionality wasn't. So, intersectionality is about the differences in your background. So, it's kind of saying that white able-bodied men are the most privileged people, and any steps away from that that you take give you additional disadvantage. So by being women, you're disadvantaged one bit. If you're also not white, you're disadvantaged another bit. If you're also then disabled, you're disadvantaged some more, and that these just add up and up and up. So there were a few bits there, but there really wasn't very much written about the way that it might be harder for some people to go through the menopause when they were autistic. So, bringing this to a sort of a close, then. So, that's everything we found, and this is our interpretation. So, these are some things that we think might help autistic people during the menopause. And I think it's really important to just put in another reminder. There were only 15 sources in our review. We don't know enough to know that this is definitely true. This is just the best information we've got at the moment. So I think it's important for autistic people to learn about the menopause early, maybe around the age of 30. And that would include things like knowing there's variation in menopause experiences, how severe the symptoms might be, knowing that sensory sensitivities and meltdowns might increase, knowing that it might get harder to cope with difficult things in life, and coping with symptoms could get harder, and also that masking might get harder, because I think that was something that felt very poignant to me. We also thought that communicating with other people, other autistic people about their menopause symptoms might help people to feel more connected and less alone. That being kind and self-compassionate can help. We do have evidence of that from this research. And also learning more about being autistic can help people during the menopause. So those are some bits for individual autistic people. And then we thought it's not just about what we can do for ourselves. So, what can other people do to make autistic menopause better? And so, one of the big things is we want to make society more neurodiversity affirming. We want to make it okay for people to behave in autistic ways and communicate in autistic ways and not to get negative treatment from that. And that will reduce how hard life is before the menopause. We want to increase recognition and possibly diagnosis, if people want it, in autistic people who were born as girls and who may still be living in female bodies. And this can help people to be kinder to themselves during the menopause. We want to increase societal knowledge of menopause and also increase societal and clinician knowledge of menopause and autistic menopause. We also think partners should be understanding and offer support. That was a big thing there, that it felt like, actually when autistic people stopped being able to do everything, they needed partners to step in if they were there. And health professionals should provide accessible care, of course, just as standard. And also, we didn't find any evidence that HRT shouldn't be given to autistic people. So they should just prescribe it in line with their national prescribing guidelines. So Those were all of the bits I was going to talk about. I'll make these slides available afterwards. Danielle, do we have a list of email addresses for everybody? Can we send everybody the slides afterwards?
Yep, I can send it through Eventbrite. That shouldn't be a problem.
Brilliant. So we can send these slides around. Um, Here is a really small list of all of the sources that we included in our review. And the lovely Becky has also put in links in the chat earlier on, but these are the ways that you can access our review. So the full scientific text is available on ResearchGate, but there's that 800 word summary on the conversation if you just want a quick 5 minute read. And before we move on to questions, I'm just going to quickly mention that our next event is on Thursday, the 13th of November. You will have me again, but we'll also have three brilliant autistic midwives. So we're doing a whole session on autism and maternity. So we have Diane Fox, Karen Henry, and Rebecca Warboys, who are all autistic midwives, talking about everything to do with autism and maternity. And I'm going to leave our contact details for social media up here while we go into the chat and have some questions